Welcome back. We're going to continue talking about my practice and back to this image. Um, I had been invited to submit a proposal to do some work in the Brisbane Botanic Gardens, and for me, it was important to consider the history of that site. So, for this particular work, I did some research and I found out that Queensland's sugar legacy is traced back to the Brisbane Botanical Gardens and its first curator Walter Hill, and that's where they tested sugar, and then granulated sugar was produced. So it was from those experiments that they determined they could grow sugar in Queensland, and it became a major export industry. So I felt it was quite interesting that the connections made, and Fiji has a lot of connections to Queensland in terms of sugar and the indentured labour and the labour produced, and the CSR Sugar Company. So this work I produced using that image I showed you, but not fully visible, this idea of this sort of fragments, this moving ocean, these sugarcane fields, and it's shot with drone footage, with this poem that I read with this sort of soundscape projected onto a banyan tree, which sort of has a lot of meaning, has a lot of connotations itself. So you can't sort of see the detail, but you can sort of see these people in the trees. And continuing in that vein, I performed with my brother and my mother a new experimental sound work, thinking about how do you tell these stories in different ways through sounds as well, and what sounds would they have been heard, and how can you tell other bits of information by approaching the work in different ways, or the story in different ways. So we go back to thinking about the photograph, or this archive that I had been trying to work with. Anna here also talks about how photography provided a system way of constructing images that could naturalize and transform observable reality into a readily understood narrative. So what they were doing at this time, with photography and with the colonies, capturing these images to promote the colonies, to promote people to be there and move there, but also to sort of look at our industry, and this idea that people became incorporated into the plantation landscape. So these are some postcards I had found, and I kept coming across a lot of postcards depicting indentured labourers. So these are people working in awful conditions, being photographed as part of the landscape. And it was something quite eerie to me. These are lithographs. That's how they hand colour the photographs for mass production here. But it was quite sort of strange. I kept coming across sort of these tourists. Anyway, it's very much of the time, but like idyllic industry, this kind of thinking. So I created my own postcards in response that went with some poems about my own travels and my experience traveling and moving with my mother, but our connections to places through experiences we have. And so, creating this sort of hand-coloured, hand-tinted, sort of quite hyper-colour, but in these sort of weird pastels, trying to emulate those aesthetics to tell a particular story. So going back to this quote by John Berger again, that a photograph is not necessarily a lie, but it isn't the truth either. It's more like a fleeting subjective impression. So these works, I decided to take the poems from these works in terms of thinking about the postcard or the experience, and how could I make them more jarring? Or how could I kind of critique the idea of the postcard more? So I produced this 2-channel video work. I was invited to make a work for Ho Biennale and that it would be shown in this colonial barn. So the video kind of shows beautiful landscapes and then sort of flashes red with this sort of jarring sound very, very briefly, alongside these poems talking about this journey. And so really it's just sort of continuing this discussion of how not just culture and tradition, but how memories and trauma are passed down generationally, and using the landscape and poetry to sort of narrate this ongoing journey about how I'm trying to uncover this familial history while critiquing this colonial history as well. So here I've inserted my mother and myself into the narrative in a contemporary sense, not just looking back, but not forward or not to the present as well. So if you would like to see any of the video works, I do have an edit of this where the dual channel can be seen on my website. So all these videos and all these works are on there if anyone wants to have a better look, in particular to get a sense of the sound I'm talking about and how the soundscapes work, but how you'll see these connections made to sound again coming through. You see these kind of links and symbols or methods repeated. So Christopher Pinney explains, he's discussing the colonial archive here, and he's talking about photographer Joanne Dreesens and historian, writer Michael Ed, who actually works with the Anthropology Museum at UQ now. So he runs that. But he's talking about sort of their experiences of personal recuperation of the archive and how the archive shifts with this. As Aboriginal people, what does the archive mean for them? So here he says that reveal the archive's contents as something like the cargo of a ship tossed on the waves of a heavy sea, subject to movements that produce a rearrangement and recoding. This reconfigured archive, influenced by new demands of personal recuperation, assumes a radically new role. So he's talking about this colonial archive had a job, it is doing it, but in the hands of these two people who claim it as something else. They claim it, these are images of my family, these are images of my people. It becomes something different for them. So this personal recuperation shifts the power and the intent of this colonial archive to a different place. I think that's a really interesting idea when we talk about how this archive is used and what power does this archive have and who has that power. I think is a very interesting thing, and I think at the Queensland Museum, curator Imelda Miller works in opening up the archives in terms of South Sea Islander communities to be able to come in, do White Gloves Day, and look at the archive and see, this was my grandfather or this was my great-grandmother, and the importance of this personal recuperation and connection to the archive and that shift in power of what the archive stands to be, not just an ethnographic documentation of people like as plantation bodies or plantation landscapes, but people who have names and real stories and mean something. So I'm looking at images still, I'm thinking about things, I'm thinking about my ancestors' experiences being indentured and the experience of those who were indentured and what they were like. And I'm thinking, how can I really express and share their experiences in a way that isn't just sort of recreating images of an archive? How can I shift this power of the colonial archive as well? And I'll go back to these images and it'll make sort of sense soon. Conventional historians of indenture primarily rely on documentary sources and archiving materials. This history claims to be balanced and objective in its approach, while these historians agree to the exploitative nature of indenture. Too heavy a reliance on quantifiable data at times makes them draw inference, which are at variance with the experience of indenture. So it's talking about how, we look at these sources, but they are subjective, and we need to be aware of what they're trying to say and what they're trying to sell. So how do we take information away that makes sense? So I'm showing you these images here, and I'm just going to go back to this one and then this one. So look at the chairs they're sitting on, the structures. These are the little details I look for when I do my paintings. I look for the kinds of work, but also I was thinking about how do I create, what would they have experienced? And I was thinking about smell and sounds and this idea that, okay, I'm going to try and step away from expectations of this colonial archive and what an archive is meant to be in our Western understanding of an archive. Whereas an archive can also be living memory through people and oral histories, but it can also be more intangible, an archive. So for me, I was thinking about how can I shift my understanding of an archive and make something actually that is an experience for my community and for myself as well, in terms of acknowledging and memorializing this history and the experience of those indentured, not just from a colonial lens or hand in writing or in photographs and images. So I created this structure looking at the barracks and looking at how the barracks were created and thinking, because I kept reading about descriptions of what it would have been like to sort of be in these cramped quarters with poor ventilation. And I was sort of thinking about the smell, the smell of the burnt sugar cane, which is sweet and sour and smoky, and I had the sort of soil around it with ash in it. And you have the smell of the corrugated iron, and I created a scent in the space as well, like where I burnt sugar and I put molasses in it, and I created this sort of spray that that could be put in the room as well to kind of create that, as well as smoked this room with burning sugarcane, when I turn the smoke alarms off. But also inside the space, there was a sound of my mum singing this Bhojpuri song, which was had mixes of sort of Tamil loanwords as well, because in South Africa, in Natal, where they were indentured, people spoke multiple Indian dialects. They were not just from one area. So there was a lot of hybridization of language there as well. And I also sort of created this sort of video that was sort of toned and tinted like those postcards, thinking about, I guess, a journey or being in those fields or going past them, but being very aware of the camera at a moment in there as well. So I painted the inside black because it's a memory, it's not a full picture, and I wasn't recreating something. I was trying to create an experience which was sensory, so sound and smell and sight. And I sort of emulated that chair, but I painted it black as well because it's sort of, it's like fragmented, it's not a full picture, but I also wanted it to be clear that it's about a memory, it's about memories, it's about living memory as well. So that this structure, that I built, in a sense, is an archive of living memory of this history. So the song I found in my research was about how they were given the name Cooley, and it was this sort of, so part of my research goes into sort of all these details and all these things to think about. And photo by Mr. Carl Warner here. And as part of the work as well, video work was projected onto the Judith Wright Centre facade as well. And that was sort of like the crashing waves of an ocean, thinking about like inside and outside the space, and that the story sort of began with that ocean, and sort of continues with that ocean as well. And continuing with this sort of with this vein, I did a performance with just my brother this time, using vessels to talk about vessels being these people who were taken vessels being bodies who are sort of taken on these ships and taken to work, vessels being ships themselves, as well as these objects that hold water and hold different things, such as memory included. So we did this performance where we sort of mixed salt and ash and water, and then played sounds from the lotus, the vessels, as well as I recited this ship list and this poem that I created as part of the work. So thinking about here that sound, I did this collaborative work with my brother, thinking about like trying to think again about this archive and the colonial archive, and how perhaps the archive isn't just writing and images, but it can also be sounds. So, you know, we talked about smells, but here in this instance, we were thinking about sounds and how these vessels could hold sounds that would have been experienced during indenture. So we sort of created this first iteration experiment, because the first time you do something, it's not perfect and there's so much room to develop and go, where we created this interactive sound installation where the audience interferes with the sound as they come closer, but it's fragmented, and it's really considering that, you know, that this memory is not in a full piece either. So it's using senses here, and then I've got these paintings which acknowledge the histories and experiences of these women, sort of in the same way those previous works did, but in a more refined place where it's like there's just much more of the paper visible, which you normally never do in indie miniature painting. You cover everything, but here removing the traces of the environments and just having these women and acknowledging there's this lost information and what really happened to them, and do we know what their experiences were, and how, you know, what's their place in this archive, and what's their place in history, and you know, how do we remember them? And so in terms of sort of, I guess, like addressing the archive and responding to the archive, trying to create one, but also trying to fill gaps within a colonial archive through doing this. And I just want to show you one of these images because in the paintings I look for images as reference points about the different forms of labour women did. And you can see children here working as well, which was really common. So my most recent project is a very, very tired picture of me working when I was up on your study week. Shooting up in far north Queensland in Home Hill, very tired, bags under eyes, early morning starts, and we're kind of creating different works here. This idea of the fire and violence on women and violence on the landscape. I guess you could think of like Enemy and Vendetta and works like that. So producing a short, little more narrative-based film, which is a first for me, and then a more multi-channel work out of this. And so it was the first time I worked with a team. So here I worked with cinematographer Audrey Lan. I worked with Lawrence English sound recording, and my brother doing the sound design. And we shot this work on 16mm, so I have no idea what it looks like until I get the film back. But I just sort of wanted to show you this process is ongoing, and trying to tell these stories in different ways or work that out is an ongoing process that's not resolved because, you know, you keep researching more and thinking about more things, and, you know, there's so many approaches and ways of doing that. But it's just about, you know, you make something, you reflect on it, and then, you know, you try and refine it implicitly. Like it's not something that as an artist, you know, working outside of the institution you think about, but in the institution it's a big part of that, being aware of that learning and that development and those decisions you make. Right, yeah, I can say that fire was very, very hot and that camera was very, very heavy, and I don't do enough exercise to be able to handle that, but I did. So as per usual, I do have some links available. The PDF is up in the course content if you want to click on any of the links. There's my website with all the videos of the works I mentioned will be there. There's an article on the show at the Institute of Modern Art and that structure on Art Asia Pacific. There's also a conversation I had earlier in the year with curator and South Sea Islander woman Imelda Miller. She was so generous and fantastic. I really do recommend listening to that, as well as some Radio National interviews I did in 2018 as well, and I wanted to put in that link to Australia's history of kidnapping South Sea Islanders, so I put that link in there as well because it's a really important history to acknowledge. And if you're around, I have a couple of works in Brisbane City Outdoor Gallery exhibition, as well as that exhibition at Milani I mentioned to you, which closes soon, I think. So you can check those out if you're interested. And here is some artists that I thought would kind of be interesting to go from, who work with the archive in different approaches, reimagining representation about who owns the archive. And again, if you're kind of interested, I do recommend watching the representation lecture on YouTube if you haven't already. Okay. Thanks, I hope you're all going well in your tasks, but hopefully this helps you think about how you work as an artist and how research may or not be important to you, and how does that shift or change, and what does research look like?